The hall of the Grand Council stretched wider than a city and higher than a mountain, made of shining crystal that caught the light of 3 suns and scattered it across 1,000 alien faces, a place where the voices of rulers and ambassadors echoed like thunder, where truth and lies mixed like smoke in the wind, and where today a subject unlike any other was raised for all to hear, the subject of humanity. Rows upon rows of alien species filled the chamber, each seated in great circles that rose like steps around the central floor, some with wings folded behind their backs, some with scaled tails that tapped against stone, some with eyes like burning coals, and others with long tendrils that waved nervously as the debate began, the sound of voices rising and falling like a storm at sea, each speaker eager to have their words remembered in history. At the center of the floor stood an ambassador from a tall insect race with armor like polished bronze, his mandibles clicking as he raised his voice, his tones strong yet smooth, and he declared that humans were peaceful, that humans avoided war, that humans were unlike the dangerous species of the galaxy who hunted and destroyed. He spoke with certainty, his words flowing like water, and many nodded in agreement, as if what he said was truth carved in stone. The ambassador raised his arms, and his voice grew louder. He said that humans did not crave blood, they did not spread armies across the stars, they did not seek to conquer worlds. Instead, they wished for harmony. They traded, they learned, they built, and they dreamed. He said that humanity was a safe race, a race that should be trusted, a race that should be welcomed without fear, and the council chamber filled with soft murmurs of approval. In the shadow of the hall sat a lone human, not dressed in robes of power, not dressed in silks of wealth, but in a plain dark uniform, worn with age, carrying the weight of battles long past, a man who had seen fire and smoke and had walked through fields of ruin. He sat with his hands folded, his head bowed, his eyes hidden in shadow, but his silence was louder than the 1,000 voices above him. As the insect ambassador spoke, others joined, one with scales that glowed like emeralds, another with wings that shimmered like glass, each praising the idea of human peace, each repeating the same words: humans avoid war, humans are gentle, humans are safe. And every time the words echoed through the chamber, the silent figure in the corner seemed to grow heavier, as if each word pressed against his chest, as if each lie scratched against old scars that had never healed. A younger alien with pale, silver skin and eyes like liquid metal raised a hand, his voice soft, almost uncertain. He asked if it was true that humans had never been warriors, that humans had never carried weapons that could shake the stars, for he had read stories. He had heard whispers. He had seen records that spoke of wars fought by humankind that shook even the oldest empires. His question spread across the chamber like a spark in dry grass. The insect ambassador clicked his mandibles and dismissed the thought, saying those were myths, exaggerations, the fears of old species who wished to paint humans as dangerous when they were not. But the question had already taken root, and eyes across the chamber shifted, some filled with doubt, some filled with fear, and still the human veteran sat in silence, his breathing slow, his gaze locked on the crystal floor beneath him, remembering fields where no grass grew anymore. The chamber quieted for a moment as the memory of wars not spoken lingered in the air. Then another alien, one with horns like black stone curving high above his head, asked again if humanity truly avoided war. For his people had once seen human ships at the edge of their worlds during a time of fire. He remembered the sight of burning metal in the sky, though he had been only a child, and the memory had stayed with him like a scar. Voices rose again, some defending humanity, some laughing at the idea of human armies, others whispering that perhaps the truth was hidden. Perhaps humans wore a mask of peace while keeping weapons in the dark, and still the silent man sat, his hands steady, his eyes heavy with memories, each voice around him another echo of the same mistake, the same blindness, the same denial of what humanity truly was when pushed against the wall. The insect ambassador, growing impatient, raised his voice high above the others, declaring again that humans were gentle, that they avoided war at all cost, that they should never be feared, that they were a gift of peace to the galaxy. His words filled the chamber like music, his tone strong and proud, and once more many nodded, believing, trusting, hoping that the image of humanity as peaceful could be real, could be true, could be the foundation of a safer galaxy. But in the shadows of the chamber, the soldier who had walked through fire, who had seen comrades fall, who had carried the weight of war on his shoulders, knew better. He listened to each word and remembered screams in the night, cities in flames, the silence of space broken by the thunder of battle. He remembered the faces of those who never returned, and as he sat in silence, his jaw tightened, his breath grew slow, and his eyes began to rise from the floor. The debate carried on, rising and falling, voices clashing like waves against rock, some voices full of praise, others full of doubt, yet none as heavy as the silence of the man who had lived it, and though no one in the chamber yet knew it. The moment was approaching when silence would end, when truth would rise, and when the galaxy itself would tremble at the words of one human soldier who no longer wished to sit in shadow. The chamber of the Grand Council still glowed with the light of 1,000 crystals. Voices echoed like a storm locked inside the walls. But now the mood had shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted, and though many tried to cover it with laughter and denial, that seed began to grow, spreading roots into every thought that touched it. The young alien who had spoken before, the one with silver skin and eyes like flowing metal, looked around nervously, his questions still lingering in the air like smoke that would not vanish. He whispered to those near him, asking again if it was truly safe to believe that humans avoided war, asking if it was possible that the Council had made a mistake, asking if legends and warnings carried through the centuries might have held truth hidden within them. His whisper grew into small voices, and those voices began to pass from one circle to another, like ripples in a pond when a stone falls. And soon even those who wished to stay silent felt the pull of the question, and though many had never seen a human fight, though many had only met them as traders or explorers or friends, the question haunted them, for in their hearts they remembered that every legend begins with something real. The insect ambassador who had spoken so proudly before raised his arms again, his mandibles clicking sharply, his voice strong and sharp as a blade. He told the Council that doubt was poison. He said the words of the young alien were childish, dangerous, unworthy of such a grand meeting. He claimed that those who whispered of human violence did so out of fear or envy, and he declared that humanity was the key to peace in the galaxy, the one race that could unite rather than divide. Yet as he spoke with fire in his voice, the human veteran sitting in shadow remained still, but his silence felt different now. It was no longer only quiet. It was heavy, like a storm waiting behind clouds, like a weapon left sheathed. His hands did not move. His gaze remained low, but something in the way he sat drew the attention of those around him. As if even without words, he was answering the whispers with a truth too sharp to ignore. A figure from the upper rows leaned forward, her skin pale and marked with glowing blue lines that pulsed with light. She spoke with a voice that hummed like music. She said her people had once seen humans fight. She said it was long ago, but the memory had never left them. She described ships of steel that fought against impossible odds, soldiers who refused to surrender even when outnumbered 100 to 1. She said her people had respected them and feared them. The chamber grew restless. Some shouted for silence. Others demanded proof. Still others leaned closer, their curiosity growing like fire fed by wind. And once more the ambassador of bronze armor struck the air with his voice. He said these stories were lies told by frightened species. He said the human spirit was pure, and he mocked those who let shadows of old tales blind them to the truth before their eyes. But the more he spoke, the weaker his words became, for they rang hollow compared to the weight of memories. The young silver-skinned alien stood again, his voice shaking but his courage clear. He asked why the humans sitting in the corner had not spoken. He asked why one of their kind was here in silence, if not to answer. His eyes turned to the shadow where the veteran sat, and suddenly the attention of the entire hall shifted like a tide, countless eyes of every color and shape turning to the lone human, waiting, wondering, sensing that silence itself was an answer. The veteran lifted his gaze slightly, not enough to reveal all the weight of his eyes, but enough to meet the question, His breath was slow, his body unmoving. Yet the air seemed to thicken as if the hall itself held its breath. The whispers grew quiet, the arguments faded. The insect ambassador paused, for even he felt the shift, and for a moment the great council chamber was filled not with sound but with expectation, as if the galaxy itself leaned forward to listen. The human did not rise. Not yet. He remained seated, his shadow still covering him. But in that silence the memories within him stirred like old ghosts, battles that had never been told, nights filled with fire, worlds torn apart by choices no one had wanted to make. His scars pressed against his skin, his heart carried the weight of names and faces gone forever. And though he spoke no words yet, every part of his presence whispered that peace and war were not as simple as the council wished to believe. Another ambassador spoke, a tall being with horns of silver that curved like blades. He said that if humans hated war so deeply, why then were their soldiers remembered even in distant stories? Why then had his ancestors warned that a cornered human was the most dangerous enemy in the stars? His question cut deeper than the rest, for it carried no hatred, only a calm searching for truth. And in the silence after it was spoken, many realized they wanted the same answer. The insect ambassador hissed with anger, his mandibles clattering so loudly that sparks struck the crystal floor. He shouted that this was foolish, that the council was wasting time, that humanity had never brought war to the council worlds, that their ships traded and their scientists built, that their poets sang. He demanded the whispers be silenced, but the silence in the shadow was stronger than his demand. And though the human still had not spoken, all waited for him now. The silver-skinned youth stepped down a level closer to the central floor, his eyes bright like mirrors reflecting the chamber. He turned toward the shadowed figure and asked with simple words, not as an attack, not as an insult, but as a plea for truth. He asked if humanity was truly peaceful, or if peace was only the side shown when the galaxy was watching. He asked if the soldier in the shadows had seen the truth with his own eyes, and if so, what truth it was. The human raised his head slowly, his jaw tightening, his hands unfolding at last. And though he still had not spoken, the whisper of doubt had already become something larger, no longer question, no longer a rumor, but a silence filled with weight, a silence that demanded a voice, a silence that carried the promise of words that could change the way every species in the chamber would see humanity forever. The Grand Council chamber was restless. Voices clashed like waves crashing against stone. The question of humanity had broken the calm, and now doubt spread like fire across dry fields. Each ambassador struggled to control the storm, but the storm had grown too strong, too wild, too alive, and into that storm came a voice that cut deeper than all others, the voice of a warlord who had seen with his own eyes what others tried to deny. The warlord was vast, his body covered in plates of black metal fused with living flesh, scars carved into his chest like rivers of fire, his eyes burning like twin suns behind a mask of bone. When he rose from his seat, the chamber shook with the weight of his steps, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the hall like thunder that refused to fade. His words carried no hesitation, for he had no fear of the truth. He declared that humanity was not peaceful, that humanity was not safe, that humanity was not the gentle race the insect ambassador wanted them to believe. He told the chamber he had seen human ships in the age of war. He had fought near them. He had watched them fight until stars burned red. And though his people were powerful, though his warriors were proud, they had never faced soldiers like those, soldiers who did not stop, soldiers who did not bend, soldiers who turned death itself into a weapon against their enemies. The chamber gasped. Some shouted that it was lies. Others demanded silence. But the warlord raised his hand, and the power in his presence forced quiet. He told them that the memory of humans in war was not rumor, but reality, that he still saw their faces in his sleep, that even now his scars ached when he remembered the sound of their battle cries, cries not of joy, but of fury, of loss, of defiance. And he told them that the galaxy was blind if it believed those cries could ever belong to a peaceful race. The insect ambassador leapt forward with rage, his mandibles clattering, his voice sharp and desperate. He said the warlord twisted old stories into lies. He said the galaxy had moved beyond those days. He said the humans they knew now were builders, not destroyers. But the chamber no longer listened to him, for the weight of the warlord's words pressed harder, and the silence of the human veteran pressed harder still. Silence heavier than stone. Silence that drew the attention of every mind present. The warlord pointed toward the shadow where the human sat, his massive hand trembling with the fury of memory. And he demanded that the man rise. He demanded that the council hear from the mouth of one who had walked through fire, one who had carried the banner of humanity through war. He demanded truth, not words from insects, not whispers from the young, not songs from those who wished for peace, but truth from the soldier himself. The chamber held its breath. Every eye turned again to the corner. The human veteran sat unmoving, his head lowered, his hands still resting on his knees. But something in the air shifted, something in the shadows stirred. The weight of silence grew so heavy that even the boldest voice fell quiet. Even the insect ambassador dared not speak, for they all felt that the moment was approaching when silence would no longer hold. The warlord's voice softened, no longer thunder but stone breaking under pressure. He told the chamber that humans may speak of peace, they may live in peace, but deep within them there is something else, something old, something unyielding. He told them that he had learned it the hard way, that his warriors had fallen one by one against human fire, that even as death closed around them, the humans kept fighting, not for conquest, not for glory, but because they could not stop, because surrender was not written in their blood. The chamber trembled with unease. The silver-skinned youth looked at the veteran with wide eyes. The blue-lined ambassador bowed her head. Even those who had laughed before now whispered in fear, for the truth had grown too loud to ignore, and still the human had not spoken. But his silence was louder than all their voices, and his silence was truth waiting to become words. The insect ambassador tried once more to rally, his arms raised high, his mandibles snapping with anger. He shouted that humans were safe, that humans were kind, that humans had proven themselves in trade and trust. But his words cracked, his voice shook, for even he could feel the weight of the shadow in the corner. Even he could sense that the council was no longer his to control. The moment had slipped from his grasp. The warlord stepped closer to the center, his towering form like a mountain of scars and armor, his eyes locked on the veteran, and he said with a voice that shook the chamber that only one voice mattered now. The voice of the soldier who had seen, the soldier who had fought, the soldier who carried the truth of humanity within him. And as his final words echoed through the chamber, the human veteran began to move. He did not stand quickly. He did not rush. He rose with the weight of years pressing against his shoulders, every movement deliberate, steady, unshaken, his figure emerging from the shadow like a blade being drawn from its sheath, his eyes lifting at last, eyes that carried not fire but something colder, something deeper, the memory of war that never leaves, the truth that cannot be hidden. The chamber fell into silence, a silence so complete that even the crystals seemed to dim. The insect ambassador froze. The warlord bowed his head slightly. The silver-skinned youth stopped breathing for a moment, and all across the hall, every alien felt it. The shift, the change, the arrival of something that could not be undone, the voice of a soldier about to speak. The human veteran stood fully now, his back straight though bent by years of battle, his chest broad though scarred beneath the uniform, his hands open at his sides, steady as stone, and though he had not yet spoken a single word, the council understood that the moment had come, the moment when silence would break, when doubt would become truth, when the galaxy itself would tremble at the voice of humanity. The chamber of the Grand Council was silent like the deep void between stars. No voice rose. No whisper dared to move. Every eye fixed on the human veteran who now stood in the center of shadow and light, his body worn by years of battles, his face carved by the weight of memory, and his eyes cold yet alive with fire that had not died even when war had tried to crush it. The veteran took a slow breath, the sound soft yet heavy enough to carry through the vast hall. His gaze moved across the countless faces staring at him, some filled with fear, some with doubt, some with the desperate hope that his words would confirm the fragile dream of peace they had built around humanity. But the silence held as he opened his mouth and his voice came forth, calm, steady. A voice that had commanded men in fire and had spoken to death without trembling. "You speak of humans as peaceful," he began, his words flowing like iron melted and reshaped. "You say we avoid war. You say we turn from blood. You say we are safe, and you're not wrong. We do avoid war. We do turn from blood. We do wish for peace because we know too well what war costs, because we have felt the burn of it in our flesh, because we have buried too many of our own beneath cold earth, because we carry the cries of the fallen in our dreams every night." The chamber shivered with his voice, not because it was loud, but because it carried truth, the kind of truth that could not be broken by argument, the kind of truth that had been lived and suffered and carried like a chain around the heart. The aliens leaned forward, their bodies trembling, their breath slow, for every word struck them deeper than the thunder of armies. "We hate war," the veteran said, and his hands tightened at his sides, his knuckles white, his jaw hard. "We hate it because it takes until nothing remains. It takes sons from mothers. It takes fathers from children. It takes hope from the future and leaves behind only ashes. We hate it because it never leaves, because even when the battle is over, it keeps fighting inside us, and no song, no prayer, no counsel can erase it." The silver-skinned youth trembled, his mirrored eyes wide, and he whispered almost to himself that humanity must then be weak. For those who hate war surely lack the will to fight. But the veteran turned his gaze on him, not with anger, not with scorn, but with the weight of truth sharper than any blade, and the young one fell silent as the soldier spoke again. "Do not mistake hate for weakness," the veteran said, his voice low but sharp. "We hate war, but when it comes to us, when it hunts our homes, when it strikes at our families, when it dares to threaten what we love, we do not run, we do not beg, we do not kneel, we fight. And when we fight with everything we are, with everything we have, with everything we will ever be. And we do not stop, not until the fire dies, not until the enemy is gone, not until we are the last breath left standing." The warlord who had spoken before lowered his head slowly, his massive body shivering with the memory of what he had seen. His people had learned that lesson with blood and fire, and now the words of the veteran struck like a blade driven into old scars. But still he listened, and still the chamber held its silence, for all now knew they were hearing something greater than debate. They were hearing the raw voice of history. "We do not glorify war," the veteran said, his eyes drifting upward as if seeing worlds long burned. "We do not hunger for it. We do not seek it. We do not wear it as a crown. We carry it like a curse carved into us by centuries of fire, a curse passed down by those who survived when they should have fallen, a curse that whispers in our blood that survival is not enough, that surrender is not possible, that peace will never be given but must be earned with blood when it is denied." The chamber was heavy. The insect ambassador trembled with rage but found no words. His mandibles clattered but no sound came. For the truth in the soldier's voice drowned him. The council sat frozen, their wings, their tails, their tendrils all still as stone, and the veteran's voice continued, each word another hammer against the fragile illusion that had been built in this hall. "You asked if we are peaceful," he said, "and I tell you this. Yes, we are. We wish for peace more than any race I know. But you must understand why. You must understand what forged that wish. We wish for peace because we know the other path too well. We wish for peace because we have walked the fields of death. We have lived in nights where the stars themselves burn with fire. We have seen cities fall and children cry for mothers who would never come. We wish for peace because war has burned us and scarred us and taught us its price." He stepped forward then, slow and steady, each step echoing across the chamber. And though his voice did not rise, it felt as if the walls themselves carried his words. "We are peaceful until you force us not to be. We are gentle until you touch what we love. We are calm until you strike our homes. And when that happens, when war comes to us, when blood is demanded of us, then you will see what we become. Then you will understand why you whisper of us in fear. Then you will know that humanity does not fall. Humanity endures. Humanity resists. Humanity fights." A shiver passed through the hall. Ambassadors clutched at their seats, wings folded tight, horns lowered, tendrils coiled. for though the veteran spoke with calm, the fire beneath his words was undeniable. It was not the fire of rage. It was not the fire of pride. It was the fire of memory, of truth, of experience carved into the soul, the kind of fire that no peace treaty could erase. The kind of fire that once unleashed would consume everything before it. The veteran fell silent for a moment, his chest rising and falling, his gaze sweeping across the hall, and in that silence, every alien understood that his words were not meant to threaten, not meant to boast, but simply to remind, to show the truth that they had tried to bury under songs of peace, to show that humanity did not avoid war because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to know its cost. And as the silence stretched, the galaxy waited for what he would say next. The chamber was still wrapped in silence, but within that silence the human veteran's words began to change, no longer calm lessons spoken for reason alone, but stories rising from scars, memories he had carried across countless nights. And as he breathed deeply, his eyes no longer saw the council before him. His eyes saw the past, and through his voice the chamber began to see it as well. "You speak of peace," the veteran said, his voice steady yet trembling with weight, "but you cannot understand our peace without knowing our wars. You cannot understand why we fear conflict unless you walk with me through the ruins that shaped us. So I will tell you, not to boast, not to frighten, but to show you why we pray for peace even as we are shaped for battle." He raised his hand slowly, fingers curling as if he held something unseen, and his words painted the first memory, a city of stone and glass standing proud beneath a sky of blue. Then the sky torn apart by fire, enemy ships blotting out the sun, streets breaking under falling metal, children screaming, towers collapsing, the smell of smoke so thick it became the air itself. He told them how he was young then, barely a man, but already holding a weapon, already forced to stand in the flames as the world he loved crumbled to ash. The aliens in the chamber shifted uneasily. Their wings trembled, their tendrils coiled, for the images he conjured struck harder than weapons. They were not stories of glory, they were stories of survival. And though he spoke with no pride, his words cut deeper than any tale of victory, for the pain in them was sharper than pride could ever be. The veteran lowered his hand, his eyes heavy, and he spoke again, of a battlefield where snow turned red with blood, where bodies lay in silence beneath the cold wind, where machines of war thundered against each other until the earth itself cracked. He told them of nights where the sky glowed with fire, where every breath felt borrowed, where comrades beside him fell and never rose again. He told them of names he remembered, names he whispered in the dark so they would not be forgotten, names that haunted his dreams long after the war was over. He paused, the chamber hanging on his silence. And when he continued, his voice was lower, sharper, carrying grief deeper than any council had ever heard. He told them of a village where he found nothing but silence. Homes burned, doors shattered, no voices, no laughter, only shadows on the walls where families had once stood. He said that he hated war because of that village, hated it because peace had been torn from it so cruelly, and hated it because no matter how hard he fought, no matter how many enemies he cut down, he could never bring that village back. The insect ambassador trembled now, his hands shaking, his mandibles clicking with no words to follow. The warlord bowed his head lower still, his memory of human fire now bound to the soldier's words, and the silver-skinned youth who had asked so boldly before now covered his face with his hands, as if the images spoken had burned into his soul. The veteran stepped closer to the center of the floor, his boots echoing like distant drums, and he spoke of another memory, one that weighed heavier than all the rest, a final stand on a barren world where no trees grew, no rivers flowed, only dust and stone and war. His unit was surrounded. The enemy came in waves without end, and though every man and woman with him knew they would not see another sunrise, they stood, they fired, they fought, and they fell one by one, until he was alone, his weapon broken, his hands bleeding, his body broken. Yet even then he rose again. Even then he kept moving forward, because surrender was not possible, because stopping was not written in him. His voice cracked thin, the first sign of pain breaking through the iron of his tone, and the council felt it, a wave of sorrow heavier than chains, a weight that pressed against every heart, and though not a single alien had lived his battles, they all felt as if they had walked through them with him. They all felt the loss, the fire, the endless scars, and they all understood that his words were not stories of distant wars, but memories carved into his flesh. "We hate war," the veteran said again, softer now, almost a whisper, and the chamber leaned closer to catch it. "We hate it because it has taken more from us than you can imagine. We hate it because every one of us who survives carries a piece of the dead inside. We hate it because it makes us something we never wanted to be. But do not mistake this hate for weakness. It is the opposite. It is strength born of suffering. It is resolve born of fire. It is the reason we do not run when the storm comes. It is the reason we stand when others fall. It is the reason humanity endures when all else is lost." The silence that followed was colder than space itself. The insect ambassador dared not raise his voice. The warlord's eyes burned with the fire of old memory. The blue-lined ambassador closed her eyes and bowed her head in respect, and the silver-skinned youth whispered again, not a question this time, but a quiet prayer that he had been wrong to doubt, that he had been blind to the truth carried in the voice of the soldier. The veteran let the silence grow, his chest rising with slow breath, his gaze moving across the faces of the council, and though his voice had fallen quiet, his presence filled the chamber like a storm that refused to fade, and the memory of his words, of his fire, of his grief, had already carved itself into the minds of every being who sat in that hall, never to be forgotten. And so he stood there, not a conqueror, not a king, not a monster, but a soldier who had walked through fire, a soldier who had lost more than he could ever name, a soldier who hated war because he knew it too well. And in that moment, the galaxy finally understood why the whispers of humanity were filled with both fear and respect. The council chamber hung in silence heavy as stone, as if the air itself feared to move, and the weight of the veteran's words pressed against every soul in the vast hall like chains woven of fire and grief and memory. No being dared to speak for a long moment, for the echoes of battle still lingered not in sound, but in the imagination of all who had listened. The insect ambassador, whose voice had once been quick and sharp, now trembled in his seat, his wings buzzing faintly, as if the weight of unseen storms pressed against him, his eyes wide, and wet with something that his kind rarely showed. His mandibles clicked, but no words came, only silence, followed by a slow bow of his head, as though respect and fear had crushed him into humility. The warlord, with scales of iron and eyes that once glared with challenge, sat hunched forward, his claws pressed together, his forehead low against his hands. Once he had spoken of human war, as though it were rumor, and now he bowed like a student before a master who had revealed truths too great to ignore, and his chest rose and fell with long, slow breaths, as though he tried to steady a fire inside that had been awakened. The blue-lined ambassador, who had spoken with soft curiosity, now closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her hands folded tightly together. Her people had never known war as humanity, had never seen entire cities burn or oceans filled with the wreckage of endless machines, and her heart quivered with both sorrow and awe. She whispered prayers not for herself, but for the humans whose burdens she could now feel through the soldier's words. The silver-skinned youth, who had once asked his bold question, no longer looked bold at all. He sat hunched over, his hands pressed against his face, his shoulders shaking with quiet breaths, as if shame and revelation had struck him together. He had asked why humans hated war, and now he had been given an answer too heavy for his spirit. He whispered to himself, as though begging forgiveness from the soldier before him, and from the dead whose names he would never know. The veteran stood still in the center of it, all his shadow long beneath the great light, above his eyes steady, but tired, his shoulders heavy yet unbowed. He let the silence linger, because silence itself was a truth. Silence itself was a battlefield where every soul in that hall now stood facing the weight of humanity. At last the insect ambassador spoke, his voice unsteady, trembling with both fear and respect. He asked, if all humans carried such fire, if all of them walked with ghosts, if every man and woman from the distant blue world held such scars and such strength, and he asked it not as a challenge, but as a plea, as though the answer itself might decide the fate of his people. The veteran looked at him with eyes that carried storms. He said not all humans had walked through the fire as he had, but every human carried the potential. Every human carried within their blood a memory of survival older than history. Every human held both love and wrath waiting beneath the surface, and though many prayed to never awaken, war had a way of waking what slept. A murmur passed through the chamber, soft yet filled with awe. Some feared it, some respected it, all felt it. The warlord lifted his head, then his voice deep and slow. He asked why humans, if they carried such strength, if they carried such fury, still chose peace, why they did not rise as conquerors across the stars, why they had not already bent the galaxy under their iron hands. The veteran turned his gaze upon him, and his voice grew heavy with sorrow. Once more he said that humanity had learned through fire that conquest brought nothing but graves. He said that they sought peace because they knew what war cost. They did not seek to dominate, but to survive. They did not wish to spread their fire across the stars, but to protect what little peace they could build for themselves and for their children. The warlord bowed deeper this time, his iron scales clinking together like chains, surrendering to truth, and his voice fell silent. Then the silver-skinned youth raised his head, his face pale, his eyes wide. He asked what humans would do if peace was broken, if war came to their door again, if another people, another empire sought to crush them. He asked this not in challenge, but in fear and hope both at once. The veteran's voice grew colder than steel. He said that if war came, if peace was broken, then humanity would rise again, as it always had. They would hate it, they would curse it, but they would not run, they would stand, they would fight, they would burn if they must. And though they prayed never to face such days again, if forced, they would endure, and they would win, because that was what humanity did when there was no other choice. A ripple of silence followed again, but this silence was different. It was not ignorance, it was understanding. The blue-lined ambassador lifted her gaze, tears glistening along her cheeks. She said softly that the galaxy would remember these words. She said that they must never forget what humanity carried both in its love of peace and in its wrath and war. She said that the council must learn from this before it was too late. The insect ambassador nodded, trembling, still his wings folding tightly against his back. He said that he would return to his people with these words. He said that they must never provoke the fire of humankind, for such fire would not only burn enemies, it would scorch the stars themselves. The warlord thumped his chest, once a sign of respect among his kind, his voice low. He said that he had doubted now. He doubted no longer. He said that the soldier's fire was proof enough. He said that his people would not take humanity lightly again. The silver-skinned youth bowed, deeply unable to speak further, for shame weighed upon him. Yet respect carried him too, and in his silence the chamber felt his change. The veteran gave no smile, no pride, only silence. And in that silence the council realized that they were not looking upon a conqueror, not looking upon a tyrant, but looking upon a man who had walked through fire and chosen peace, though peace was never promised. And in that moment, the galaxy changed a little. For every ambassador, every warlord, every voice present would carry this truth home, and the story of a single soldier would become a lesson whispered across worlds. The chamber slowly emptied, yet the weight of the moment did not leave the air. It lingered like smoke after fire, clinging to walls and hearts. Alike the veteran remained standing silent as a monument, while the ambassadors filed out, some whispering among themselves, others still too shaken to form words. The silence of the soldier had burned deeper into them than his words themselves, and now that silence traveled with them as they stepped back into the endless corridors of the council station. The insect ambassador paused before leaving, his wings trembling in the still air, his eyes wide and shining with a strange mix of fear and reverence. He bowed low, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm of respect, before he turned away, knowing that his people would forever speak of this day as the day humanity's shadow stretched across their hive. The warlord of scales moved slower than he had entered, his great claws no longer clanging, but dragging gently against the polished floor. He turned once before the veteran, his eyes glowing faint with respect, and he struck his chest once more, a gesture that meant kinship among warriors. And then he left his silence, saying more than any word could. The blue-lined ambassador walked as though she carried a new, bird in her hands clasped together, her lips moving in soft prayer, not for her own people, but for humanity and perhaps for the galaxy itself, she whispered that peace must be guarded like fragile glass, for if it shattered, the fire of man would spill into the stars, and no one would be untouched by its heat. She left then, her heart heavy, but her spirit changed. The silver-skinned youth lingered longest. He stood trembling before the veteran, unable to meet his gaze, and yet unable to look away. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, saying that he had been foolish, that he had asked without knowing the weight of what he asked. He bowed deeply lower than his kind ever bowed, and he promised that he would tell this story to his world, not as a warning alone, but as a lesson in both strength and sorrow. Then he too turned, and left his shoulders heavy with shame, but also with a spark of new respect. The chamber grew empty until only the veteran remained. A great light above dimmed slowly, as if even the stars beyond wished to bow before the truth. He had spoken. He breathed deep, closing his eyes for a moment, his chest rising and falling, not with pride, but with exhaustion. He had not sought to teach, he had not sought to frighten, he had only spoken truth, the truth of blood and fire that no human wished to carry, but carried all the same. Far across the council station, words spread faster than fire, down the long corridors, through the glowing halls, across the crowded markets, and into the ears of thousands. Every being who heard the whispers felt their hearts tighten. The story of the human soldier traveled like storm wind. Some heard it with awe, some with terror, some with deep sorrow, yet all listened. None dismissed it, for truth carried a weight that could not be ignored. Soon the message reached distant stars. Ambassadors sent word to their home worlds. Entire councils gathered to hear what had been spoken in the great chamber. In one world, insect queens listened in silence, their wings shivering as they realized that humanity could never be measured by numbers alone. In another world, warlords of scaled legions sat around their fires and bowed their heads in respect to a race that had chosen peace despite carrying fire enough to consume empires. In yet another world, gentle peoples who had never known war wept for the humans whose souls bore scars, unseen yet unforgotten. The galaxy shifted not with the clash of fleets or the thunder of cannons, but with the whisper of a single man's words, as truth traveled through space and time faster than any vessel. It touched worlds without weapons and empires filled with armies. It carved a new place for humanity in the great song of stars, no longer as a mystery, no longer as mere newcomers, but as a people both feared and respected. Love for their search for peace, yet feared for the fire they carried when peace was broken. The veteran did not seek this. He returned to his quarters, quietly, his steps heavy, as if each echoed with ghosts unseen. He sat upon a small bench and looked out the window into the endless black sea of stars. His reflection stared back at him, lined and tired, yet unbroken. He whispered names softly, names of those who had walked beside him, those who had fallen, those who had given everything so that he might stand here today. Their echoes were his true companions, their memory his true counsel. On Earth, news of the council chamber silence reached home. Leaders listened in awe, families wept in both pride and sorrow. Soldiers, both old and young, felt their hearts stir with recognition, for they too knew the truth of fire. Within peace, the words of the veteran would be remembered, not only across the galaxy, but within the hearts of his own people who carried the same burden in silence. And so the story grew. It became legend, not of conquest, not of domination, but of endurance, of a people who could be gentle, who could love deeply, who could build peace, yet when forced in a fire could rise with a strength that shook the stars. The legend said that humanity was not to be measured by war alone, nor by peace alone, but by the balance between the two, by the choice to seek peace though fire burned in their blood. The veteran never asked for songs, never asked for statues, never asked for glory. He remained only a man who had spoken when silence had demanded truth. Yet across the galaxy, songs were sung, stories were told. Children of alien worlds spoke his words in hushed voices around their fires. Leaders remembered his silence before making decisions that could spark conflict. Warriors of 100 races remembered the fire of humanity before raising their swords, and sometimes they lowered them instead. And in that way, the galaxy changed, not with the roar of guns, but with the whisper of truth. And in that whisper, the fire of mankind lived on, burning quietly, yet ready always to rise should peace ever fall again.